I think that stripped downness of it, no pun intended, is part of what attracts me to it, because it is very simple. Like, basically, Gaz needs to make the money so he can pay his child support. And I think that the fact that they convey a lot of things very economically is, to me, a real strength of the movie. And the things about, like, I felt like I learned everything I needed to learn about the son through what they showed, told me all I needed to know in the context of that story. Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indy Author podcast, I talk with Jennifer Hilt and Rand Walker about what writers can learn from the movie The Full Monty, including the idea of characters' external wants versus internal needs, the use of tropes such as found family, ticking time bomb, and ugly duckling progressions, and how the film uses one element to convey multiple messages. We reflect on what makes the movie universally appealing and emotionally impactful so that writers can apply those techniques to their own work. And we will be talking about movie plot points, so consider this your spoiler alert. And now let's hear from Jennifer Hilt, Rand Walker, and me about what writers can learn from The Full Monty. Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guests are Jennifer Hilt and Rand Walker. Hey, Jen and Rand, how are you doing?
Hey.
It is lovely to invite people back who I have had on the podcast before and love talking to before, and I always love return conversations. But I invited Jen and Rand back to talk about a particular topic. I'll be queuing that up in a moment, but just to give a quick bio, Jennifer Hilt is a USA Today Bestselling author and the creator of the Trope Thesaurus, an author resource, a 5-book series beloved by writers seeking to hone their craft. And Jen has been on a podcast a bunch of times talking about decoding storytelling tropes, the good, the bad, and the surprising of Kickstarter, Year End, the writing craft and the publishing voyage. That was a conversation with me and Michael LeBron, and troping your way to a stronger story. And so if any of those sound appealing, you can find those on the podcast list. And Rand Walker, who is just on the podcast fairly recently, is an award-winning author of 38 books, an associate professor of creative writing at Hampton University, and he teaches with Writers Digest University. And Rand has been on the podcast earlier talking about crafting poetic prose and redefining indie success through short fiction. And so if you want to find any of those episodes, you can go to theindyauthor.com/episodes-all and just search for Jennifer Hilt or Rand Walker, and you'll find those. And so the topic of today's conversation might not be an entire surprise to people who listened to Rand's earlier conversation with me about poetic prose, because somehow we got on to talking about The Full Monty, one of my favorite movies of all time. And I'm acting on the promise I made to invite Rand and another author back to talk about what we can learn from The Full Monty. And I love this idea of picking a movie that I think probably either many people have already seen, or I certainly feel comfortable in recommending that they see it, and talking about what we as authors can learn from that movie. So for anyone who has not watched The Full Monty, it's basically about this group of guys who decide that they're going to put on a strip show in their industrial Midlands British town, and they are going to go the full Monty, i.e. they're going to take off all their clothes in this strip show. That's basically the entire premise of the movie. And I realized that a theme that I saw that is what I want to kick off our conversation with today is the idea of the external want of a character versus the internal need. And my theory is that one of the reasons that I think I really like The Full Monty is I think that these are super clear. I don't think, although I'm going to be interested to find out, I don't think there's going to be a lot of debate about this. I think what we can learn, though, is how the filmmakers tee up these ideas of the external want and the internal need. And so we're going to walk through some of the characters and talk about the wants and needs and see how they're treated in the movie. And so I am going to start out with the primary character, Gaz. Gaz is played by Robert Carlyle in the movie. And I would say that his external want is that he needs to get money to pay child support so that he can continue seeing his son, Nath. And his internal need is to demonstrate that he can actually follow through on something. And I'm going to stop there and just throw that out and see if either of you had any different ideas about Gaz's want and need.
Well, I thought about something when I saw the movie earlier today. That Gaz is probably the worst and best father at the exact same time. he's doing the best he can with that, but it seems like the best part of him is his relationship with his son.
Yes.
And even though he's, done things that most fathers would never do with their sons, including having hope to finance the strip club thing. I think that dynamic there where you have the external one, which is him to be able to have access to his son without, and they really did a good job of making the father, stepfather,
and his ex-wife's boyfriend.
Yes, or whatever relationship they have.
Yeah.
He had that air of entitlement to a situation, and they always have that character who kind of shows up. He's like, I know better than you. I'm not your son's biological father, but I can parent him better than you can. And you have that whole dynamic, and this guy's just, he's dealing with a lot of different things. It's not just the fact that he's trying to have access to a son. He's trying to make sense of his life in a world where what he did for a living no longer matters. It's no longer relevant. So that, I think, is also one of his wants. I think I'm kind of straying a little bit from your question, but it seems like
straying from the question is kind of like half the fun. But I do agree with what you were saying about the best father and the worst father, because sometimes I wonder if this film would get made in exactly the same way today, because some of the things you see Gaz letting his son do, and his son is, I don't know, 9 or something like that. He's letting him drink the leftover beer in the glasses in the bar, and he's letting him sit there while, all the guys strip while they practice for their gig. And I just wonder if that would be like too far out. I mean, it all feels very sort of innocent when it's done in the context of the movie, but there's that one moment where the one guy says, I can't bring my kids in. This is no place for kids. Yeah. And, that's obviously a crack right at Gaz and his parenting methods.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summation of Gaz's character. I thought it was really interesting. I watched this when it first came out years ago, and now watching it, and I just was like struck by a couple things that are straying from the thing, as Matty knows that I like to do. And one was, it did really strike me that I can't believe that was the whole plot of that movie. Like, I don't think if that movie would be made now, you could use that without a whole lot more subplots or other things, because it was like I was watching it and I kept stopping it to see, okay, where are we? Okay, we're 30 minutes in and they're still like mucking around with like, we're all unemployed. And, it's just kind of like really interesting how the timing, because the movie was made in 1997, I think. Just, it was super interesting to see like how our paces had changed with, watching movies and stuff. So that was really interesting to me to think of. I think that the development of some of the other characters, like there seemed like basically 3 main characters: the former boss, the one we just talked about, and then the guy who was his friend who was overweight.
Dave.
They got the most development, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But I think if we were going to redo the movie now, there would be some other subplots about the other 2 guys who then had a relationship, because that was just kind of mentioned on the side. And then I think too, they would probably do more about the son too, because it was just really interesting. Wow, it was just really interesting to me to watch the pacing of like, oh, they're back at the unemployment center, okay, and they're having this conversation again, and and things like that. So it's interesting to watch how our tastes change and how we've become more impatient, I guess.
Yeah, I think that stripped downness of it, no pun intended, is part of what attracts me to it, because it is very simple. Like, basically, Gaz needs to make the money so he can pay his child support. And I think that the fact that they convey a lot of things very economically, and that's another topic we might want to talk about, is to me a real strength of the movie. And the things about, like, I felt like I learned everything I needed to learn about the son through what they showed. Like, the son's reaction to his dad being kind of a goofball told me all I needed to know in the context of that story. And I'm realizing that, how do I want to say this? I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but I started thinking about, why is this movie generally appealing to men and women equally? And because at the beginning, it is very explicitly, like, they're not even subtle about themes or anything. They like hit you in the face with it. It's, they're saying, men are just, we're obsolete, pretty soon there's going to be some biological thing that the women don't even need us, like, to procreate. And so, on the surface, I guess this is the sort of internal versus external question. On the surface, it just seems like, guys trying to get their act together, literally and figuratively. But I think that there's more of an emphasis on the value of sort of childlike joy in something. And what made me think about that was that there's definitely this life is too short to waste it kind of theme that underlies a lot of the characters' wants and needs. And the line that I think really encapsulate this is you have the rest of your life to wear a suit. I'm leaving out the expletive. And this idea, like I got to that line and I was like, oh man, if I were still in my corporate job, I think I would burst into tears. Because it's the whole theme is living up to the expectations of society and what you give up to do that. Thoughts about that?
Well, I was just going to say, I thought it was really interesting when they were having that discussion, those guys, when they were talking about feeling like they were extraneous, of thinking like, oh, wow, I didn't at all pick up on that the first time I watched it, when I feel like that's a real discussion now in society. What I just thought was interesting was I didn't pick that up all those years ago. And now when I watched it, I was like, oh, it's interesting. That theme was like there. And now I feel like that's a much more present theme we see, in society working its way. So that was really interesting. That was just really interesting to me. And I didn't feel like it was really a political movie in, any way, other, kind of these poor field workers getting put out of their jobs. So that was just one thing that I was going to mention, that I just thought about that. And then one other thing that struck me when we were talking about the child and like the old timiness of it, I guess, or nostalgia, it has like a certain nostalgic tone. Yeah. I always think it's interesting when kids are in a movie because they seem to have two purposes. One is to cause trouble and one is to prop up a character. And I was like, oh, this is such a low maintenance kid, like a cat, Like he never had his own needs or any, like, he was just there to like, oh, whatever the dad did. A couple times he was annoyed with the dad, but not really, especially if so that was just like really, that's always interesting to me to see like what the function of a kid is in a movie. Because a lot of times it seems like it's kind of obviously one of those two things. So anyway, those were just like my two thoughts on him.
One of the things that I found interesting was these little ironic scenes. Let's go back to the very beginning, because, the first couple of minutes is just them establishing how big a deal the steel industry was to Sheffield. And, you think about people right now who put their entire lives into just, doing something, and now their jobs are obsolete and they don't really know what to do with themselves. It kind of made a club literally of individuals who are no longer employed because, there is no job in the economy for them. And so they have all of these sexist ideas about how the world should work. And this is a 90s film. So this, to me, fits in line with the same kind of characters you would find in Billy Elliot and those other British films that came out around the same time. So one of the first ironic things that I found, this is kind of very funny, is they're walking down the stairs, objectifying women.
Right.
And they are going to put themselves in a situation to be objectified, although they don't really understand that just yet. And the whole idea, like, what do the Chippendales represent in this environment? Because, this sleek, well-oiled, fit men, and they're women who are able to pay money to be entertained by these guys. Well, these guys are broke. So there's that dynamic there of, women have everything that we don't have. So there's that jealousy, that refusal to adjust to the times and everything. And they're bringing that energy into the situation, which makes it fun. Because it's also the scene where they're looking at a magazine.
Yes. I was just going to bring that up. I love that scene.
Yeah.
And, complaining about a woman's physique. And then Dave's like, yo, we're about to do the exact same thing. No, but it's different because we're blokes. No, it's really no different. Well, maybe it's her personality, all that kind of stuff comes into play. So I love the way that they have to now wrestle with how they've made themselves objectified in a way to get through their particular situation. So the irony of all of that to me was really funny. And this is funny. I'm going to say this because when I saw this for the first time, I was in my 20s. I'm now in my 40s and I'm watching it. It hits very different. And when I saw the movie the first time, the ending in the theater, I was like, yes. but I don't think I understood exactly why I felt that way. But
Yeah.
today when I watched it, I was like, there is a liberation that comes with the freeing of all of that weight, all of those clothes, all of those expectations, all of those things that these guys are dealing with some type of insecurity. And that ending is what's letting you know that we're bigger than all of that. And it kind of got me a little choked up. I'm like, well, these guys are stripping. And here I am like, wow, this is life.
I rarely cry in movies, but I inevitably tear up at the end when they're ending the striptease, which sounds freakish if somebody hasn't seen the movie. You're like, what kind of weirdo are you that this is what makes you cry? But I dare anyone to watch that end and not at least get a little choked up. So we want to return to that. We want to return to that again at the end of our conversation, because I do want to delve into a little bit about why we have that reaction to the end. So I think that one of the purposes of Nath, you were talking about what is the role of the child, is that Nath is definitely more of a grown-up than Gaz is. And I think that in that theme of Gaz's external want is to get the money to pay his child support, but his internal need is something different. And I'm suggesting that it is to illustrate that he can carry something through to the end, and that Nath is the only one who believes in him and demonstrates that belief by being the person who goes and withdraws the money that they need in order to book the club for the event. And that I think that moment where Gaz finally accepts that he's going to take the money from Nath is another one of those kind of like choke up moments where you understand what Gaz has really needed all along. And that's somebody to believe in him, and then for him to execute on that belief in a way that leads to the desired consequences. So the next people that I want to turn our attention to in terms of the external want versus the internal need are Dave and Gerald, because I think that they have like similar situations, although perhaps at different ends of the spectrum. So Dave, I have to say, is one of my favorite movie characters ever. And I guess all the characters are like this, but that they can be like both heartbreaking and hilariously funny at the same time. And I think that Dave's issue is very clearly that, his self-image about his body. And to the extent that he believes that even his wife couldn't love him anymore, looking the way he does. I think it's interesting that his wife calls him big man, very clearly a genuine term of endearment. And yet I think in some cases that's the thing that sort of sets him off on this self-loathing path. And so then I think that the internal need, although I think maybe we can delve deeper than this, is to get very specific evidence that his wife loves him not despite his body, but because of his body. And that she has a different and more sophisticated appreciation of him than he's giving her credit for. I'll throw that out. Thoughts about that? Jen, any thoughts about that?
No, I think that makes sense. Yeah, I think he's very focused on external appearances, and that he's, judging himself that way. And he clearly, like when he didn't want to take the security job because he felt like that again was like some, a physical manifestation of kind of how low he's come. So that was kind of interesting about that. So yeah, I think he very much lives in appearances, and so struggling with that. But yeah, I agree with all that stuff. Yeah. What about you, Rand? What else you got?
Well, there's this moment at the very beginning when the Chippendales are performing, and Dave can't fit through the window to get into the women's bathroom. And think about all the symbolism that's going on. And his wife, like Gaz sees his wife in the audience. In fact, they come in to the women's restroom talking about the men, and his wife is among those people. And of course, Dave can't hear all of that. But, it's kind of like you're hearing part of a conversation. Mm-hmm. They're talking about how attractive a particular person is. And while all of this is going on, there's a little bit, I guess, of a kind of downer mood that's created by having that conversation. And one of the women decides to make light of the conversation by illustrating the very physical, we don't need men type of scenario where she stands and urinates. And I think that whole thing, and, we understood what it was, but to them, as people who are looking through a peephole or overhearing bits and pieces of it, that represents the thing they've been afraid of the whole time. And Dave is like, I thought I heard my wife. Oh, no, it wasn't her, or it wasn't what you think, or whatever. Yeah. This whole protection, and I think to me, the film more so today when I watched it than previously, felt like a film about brotherhood.
Mhm.
And all right, so let's go back to where Gaz is finally able to get Dave out of the store by telling him that one of their members, his mother, passed away. We see him willing to risk everything on a friendship that he has formed recently. Even though he saved the guy's life, well, we haven't got to that character yet, but
Yeah.
looking at all of these elements with his character, I just found him to be, he's the kind of person you just want to reach to the screen and say, Dave, it's not what you think, man. It's not what you think.
Yeah.
Stop beating yourself up over it. And I think everyone else kind of sees that. And because he has such, the personality, they think that he has the grip on it that he should have on it, but he doesn't. And the little compliments or not, well, what his wife calls him big man and everybody else they talk about his weight. Nearly all the characters say something that is derogative about his weight. So it only kind of feeds him. Mm-hmm. And I remember there's a scene in the store where he said, don't you ever call me a fat expletive. And I think at that point, we see that he's nearing the end of what he can take. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's a more complex character than Let's On initially, but I really do like him. And he's not as big, I guess maybe 97 in England.
Yeah.
Large, but American, like if you shot this
average,
in 2025, you shot, you couldn't sit something on a love handle on his body, yet he was still the big guy. And I'm like, dude, but American in his position has been totally different.
Well, and I also think that it's, even if it was being filmed today and they picked that same actor to play that role, it's both his physical size, but also his perception of his physical size. So, right. He doesn't actually have to be grossly obese for this to be a big issue for him.
At the very end, I can't even really identify him from the other men who are next.
Yeah. Right. And I think another one of these very funny, but also very heartbreaking scenes is when he goes out to the shed and back and he's eating a candy bar and also wrapping himself in saran wrap. And I just, like I laugh and cry at the same time because it's such a perfect encapsulation of his character and how misled he is about what he needs to do, whether he needs to do it as well. So I wanted to use that as a jump off to the other character who, in a way, kind of, I think Dave and Gaz are the classic, the pairing, the bromance kind of pairing in this. But the other person that kind of gets paired with Dave in some of the scenes is Gerald. And so I think Gerald is the most representative of someone who is not bringing a childlike perspective to it. He's almost completely focused on what society thinks about him, what other people think about him, what his job means for him, all those things. But there is this funny twist where both Dave and Gerald had this kind of issue about their sexuality. So Dave thinks he's like unattractive to his wife. He's not really interested anymore because he thinks he's repugnant or whatever. Whereas Gerald has this opposite issue where he's afraid that he's going to strip and get aroused. And so he goes to Dave, not realizing where Dave is coming from, and says to Dave, I'm worried about this. And Dave says, man, you're talking to the wrong person. So this idea of people's sexuality and how it's going to play out in the circumstance. Does anybody have any thoughts they'd like to share about that?
That was actually rather funny. Well, it's always funny and serious at the same time. The fact that he went to Dave, he felt comfortable enough to go to Dave with that. I was expecting him to say something entirely different. I just found the whole thing to be really interesting. Like his character was just not what I expected, but then he considered himself being vulnerable with Dave. So I guess in the end, it really didn't matter what he shared. He was being vulnerable. This is a guy who had been deceiving his wife for 6 months. He'd been deceiving himself for 6 months. And even though he picked that particular thing to lay bare to Dave, I thought it was, it represented more than it was. And I think that humor element probably just made it do double duty. Yeah. The duty of him saying something and Dave then feeling his virility is also in question and things of that nature. So,
yeah. Yeah.
What do you think, Jennifer?
Yeah, I think also he used to kind of be in some supervisory role with them. So that was kind of interesting. I thought that was really interesting of showing how they all kind of, in his eyes, had equaled out. And it really was, this time when I watched it, I saw it much more as like the buddy movie found, like we would say, found family trope that I never had like thought of that, the first time we watched it. So I was like, oh yeah, really just these guys like making new family connections even when they knew each other, but like in a more intimate way without. I thought the other thing that's interesting was for a movie that was about stripping, it seemed to have like really very little to do with sex,
Yeah.
And so that was an interesting kind of thing about it as we're talking about it, because it was like, it's just an interesting commentary. Because again, if you'd set that movie now, there would have been a lot more, I don't know, innuendos or raunchiness or something like that. I think where it does have this kind of childlike innocence to it, despite that's what they're going to do. They still, a lot of them were pretty, I guess, arrested in their development with it. I thought Gerald was my personally favorite character because he was so complex and he had so many worlds built in for him. Like he had his, dance and all those gnomes. I love the scene where he's interviewing and they're like, those gnomes are out there and then out the way like the gnomes and he just, so it's like his whole, you kind of see his world very deconstructed as the movie went along. And so I just thought that guy's a great actor anyway. So there was this kind of going from somebody who was like very blustery to whatever, a lot of things he was. And one of the guys being somebody who had like redone his bathroom like 3 months ago.
Yeah. Yeah, that's Tom Wilkinson is the actor who plays him.
Yeah, he was, So I just kind of enjoyed the layers of his character. Right.
And I really like the idea of the gnome. I think this is another great example of picking out things that can represent more than one thing. And the fact that the gnomes are what make Gerald thinks he's lost the job. It's the thing that the other guys think is the way to get back in his good graces. And then he thinks his wife loves the gnomes and she doesn't. What are your thoughts about how the gnomes were used as a symbol?
I do have, because I was thinking about that earlier when Jennifer brought it up. It's really not even the gnomes plural. It's a gnome.
It is a gnome. It is true.
One gets broken, right?
Yep.
They glue it back together.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, okay, so every time we're breaking out of this shell, they put it back together. So it still it looks almost brand new.
Yeah.
And the same one gets shattered at the end when the truth comes out. And so, that correlation, he is like that gnome. And, seeing how other people react to the gnome, because, they used the gnome as a way of hooking him into teaching them to dance. And, this is a sacred thing. And it's more, this is the identity that I have to the world, to my wife.
Yeah.
There are cracks in this glue here now that you guys have illustrated that, in my interview, there are those cracks, but you can't see them.
Mm-hmm.
And what's funny, she never sees them before she destroys it, because it's less about the gnome than it is about the relationship. She said something really powerful. She was like, I could deal with the shame of everyone out here knowing this thing, but what I can't deal with is you not talking to me. And I was like, oh, it's stung in such a way.
Yeah.
And the shattering of the gnome is just the representation of that particular moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that Dave and Gerald are in the same situation in the sense of underestimating their wife's love of them for their intrinsic selves, not because of extrinsic characteristics. And the other line that makes me choke up every time is when Dave says to his wife, who would want to see this dance, indicating his body. And she says, I do, Dave. Like, I could barely say I'm getting choked up. It's such a beautiful line and encapsulating lots and lots of emotion and history in just a couple of words. So I wanted to move on to two of the other characters. Well, one of the other characters, maybe two of the other characters. So there's Lomper. So Lomper is the character that they find who's trying to kill himself by funneling the carbon monoxide into his car, and his car is pooped out. And so Dave, not realizing what he's doing, fixes the car for him and then realizes what's going on, and they rescue him. And so I think that his external want is friendship. Although he has friendship that he doesn't recognize in the other people who play in his band, but his true internal need is for love. So he falls in love with Guy. And honestly, there were only two reasons I could explain Guy being part of the gang. One is to have Lumber, have fall in love with, and to fall in love with Lumber. And the other one is just to have somebody who is obviously like having a great time the entire time. Here's a guy, he's good looking, he's completely enthusiastic about taking his clothes off in front of people. He's just having a good time there is like nothing I can see in Guy's character that is a want or a need. He's just like a happy camper. He's a great character, but I don't see him complex in the same way that some of the other characters are.
He seems almost like a foil to the other characters.
Yes.
And that he doesn't have those same concerns.
Yeah.
He also is a person who pretty much looks like he could be a Chippendale dancer.
Yep.
But he's not flaunting that in their faces. You know, they grounded him in such a way where he never really posed a threat to anybody in the group, but they could rely upon him. And all right, so I don't even know if Horace was even on your list of people to talk about, but as a black man of a certain age, seeing a black man of a certain age on the screen, I do have to talk a little bit about that. I'm not going to jump too far ahead on it, but the way that Horace is introduced is in a bit of a slightly hypersexualized way.
Mm-hmm.
And, he's a black man, so he has the ability to dance. Mm-hmm. He's a black man. His name is Horse. Therefore, he is well endowed. Mm-hmm. And, we find out that the character is a little bit more complex than it was the way he was initially introduced. But maybe having Guy there is a way of saying, like, you got one dude here who offsets whatever thoughts you had. He might not have a lot going on upstairs, but apparently he's the one that everybody will plunk down the money to see. And maybe he's just that character. You have to have one person in a strip movie that everybody else is like, okay, yeah, we're represented up here. We got somebody. If you don't look at me, you can look at him, but we have somebody.
Well, I just love watching him during the actual strip scene because you can tell he's like having more fun than he ever has had in his entire life, the Guy character.
But he also has love. He has love.
Yes.
And that makes him probably embrace things even more than he did previously.
Yes. Yeah, well, the Horace character was the other one, in addition to Guy, that I didn't feel like was really exhibiting many wants or needs. He was kind of being the everyman in terms of his reaction to, wait, now we're supposed to take off all our clothes. And, he was enabling some plot things like he's the one who provides the family members to come and watch their practice.
He also is the only other person besides Gerald who wears a suit. Mm-hmm. He doesn't wear a tie, but he wears a suit all the time. And thanks to him, you have Beryl. I don't know if you guys remember Beryl. His niece. Yeah, with the braids. That's the person's approval that everybody ultimately is kind of seeking because she represents the kind of a youth and beauty.
Yeah.
And, like if you can get her to look at you with desire, then you've really hit upon something. And he was nervous when he saw that Beryl actually showed up. He was fine with everybody else.
Yeah.
But when she showed up, it became real to everybody that this is like, she is the ideal for whom we're trying to impress with this particular show. And I know that in these British movies, that's always a thing. You can have people who dance, but you got to have that soul brother component to it. And I think he kind of provides that. When they asked what kind of dance he did, he started lining, listening to all these dance steps. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I remember that dance step. And, and this is kind of funny. So I have to say this. While there's a part of me that was like, oh, this is kind of a stereotype, there's another part of me that's like, yeah, I know that guy. And I feel that somebody is only a stereotype when you only give the superficial components of it. And I think that his characters was more developed than that. You said earlier, Arrested Development. He doesn't seem like a person who is actually stuck in that particular stage of, of mental adolescence. He's kind of a person who's, I've done this. I've done a lot of things. I can do this. Yeah. I can make this happen. And I think he actually kind of provides a little bit of confidence here because he's not really any different from them. And going back to the end, it's hard to pick him out from the backside of the other guys at the end. So it starts out him being the black person, but at the end, it really feels like they all are just brothers equally. And I think that the last shot of the film just perfectly encapsulates the fact that these guys are just their family. That's who they are.
Yeah. I love that. Jen, thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. The one thing I was going to say is I thought that, like, for me, it was kind of the levels of shame that some of these guys had. So I don't feel like so what we were talking about, I don't feel like Guy and Horse had the same levels of shame that like the other three characters were like really wallowing in it. And so is this kind of, I think part of their roles was to show that, you know, you could come out the other side to be yourself and some things like that. So anyways, that was this kind of like, oh, interesting to see about those. I think I really thought Guy's character really wanted to be loved and valued. Like he see more, I would say romantic love seemed more important to him than friendship because, you know, he didn't have a lot of lines, but the character's body language really seemed to blossom when he was in a relationship with Guy. So that was just kind of interesting. I hadn't remembered that from the last time to see that in the movie. So I don't know. I'm always interested in the levels of shame with characters. So that's kind of like I was curious about myself. So
yeah, because you have, you know, Gaz is ashamed that he can't pay his child support. Dave is obviously ashamed of his body and needs to get over that. Gerald is ashamed of the risks to his societal standing. Jen, what are you thinking in terms of is Lomper bringing a sense of shame to this character, or is that different?
I feel like I didn't feel like he had shame more than it just didn't seem like he was aware enough in a way. And maybe he did because his character seemed to blossom so much when his romance started. But I didn't get that from him before the way I did with the three main characters. Those other guys.
There's something that Lomper does in this film that first time today, it hit me. When he played his horn at his mother's funeral, he was her sole caretaker. I mean, he had gotten to a point where he was taking care of her, isolated himself from the rest of the world outside of the band. Mm-hmm. He didn't have anything going for him outside of it. He did have a job, unlike the others, but that loneliness had to be crippling. And then he loses his mother, and he has the ability to play the horn without just breaking down. Mm-hmm. And that moment to me was really, and then you hear the band coming around him, like you're not by yourself. You're not alone. And I think it only added the cherry to the cake after they got arrested and they're at the practice and they start playing the little, yeah. And just seeing him, the way he just kind of crossed his legs and just allowed them to do that and to love on him and kind of joke with him after all that he had been through, and to see him smiling. Like the first time you see him smile as a character is when he's sitting on the hill next to Dave and Gaz. Mm-hmm. And they're like, well, we wouldn't have saved you if you weren't, our friend or whatever. It's like, friend? And I think that if that is the itch for that character, he gets scratched pretty early on. But I think the reinforcement of it, especially in the most difficult and challenging of life's circumstances, is reaffirming. And the fact that he did not care whether anybody knew that he and Guy were together. And Guy did not care.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
And the guys themselves didn't care. They kind of made a quote, which I think is just a general quote that just happened to have a double entendre, and they found themselves laughing at the gravesite. But nobody had a problem with it because they all cared about each other. And it just didn't matter. Hey, you found love? Cool. Well, we're happy for you. But we're all in this trying to find our way through this thing called life. So I thought it was beautiful.
Well, I think that another one of the reasons I love this movie is that nobody's really a bad guy. Like, even the sort of snotty ex-wife's boyfriend is clearly like trying to do the right thing for his girlfriend and her son. And, the wives are not portrayed as shrews or anything like that. All of the problems are self-generated. And then the implication is that by having gone through this experience, they are able to step away from the shame that they've been applying to themselves and, then go on to live a better life, better relationships. So, yeah, it's definitely a feel-good movie. So I wanted to talk really quickly. We've kind of gone through the wants and needs of the different characters, and I wanted to talk really quickly about another thing that I really like about this movie is the economy and storytelling. And we've mentioned a couple of examples so far. For example, the scene where Dave can't get through the window into the ladies' room, and so he's relying on Gaz to tell him what's going on. That is both, it's accommodating, like illustrating that Dave at least thinks he's too big to get through the window, but it's also necessary, to keep him from overhearing what his wife is saying to her friends. But it's also just a great metaphor for the situation, as we were talking about before. Can you think of other examples where that kind of economy of storytelling is illustrated, that they make a point with just a couple of lines or a couple of seconds of a scene?
Well, towards the end, when Dave's wife approaches him and she finds the G-string and she's like, gotcha. I was trying to figure out why you didn't find me attractive, and it turns out you're stepping out one of Gaz's girls. There wasn't a lot of dialogue in that scene. It was very quick. And as soon as she found out what it was, she didn't interrogate him about it. She accepted it and even made him feel better about himself in the process.
Mm-hmm.
But I found that interesting because while all that's going on, there's a part of me that's reading another level. It's like everyone in the entire town knows these guys are strippers. But his wife is clearly the only person who doesn't read the newspaper, because she's probably so concerned about her own situation that she couldn't see anything else other than what they had in front of them as a couple.
Yeah, I like that. Jen, what do you think?
I like the scene where they got arrested, because I felt like they accomplished a lot in a small space with that, in terms of like dealing with their kind of shame of what they were doing, and then the family issues with Gaz and his son, and just the other, officers. I don't know. It was like kind of pulling out a lot, because the same thing of people know they're practicing for this thing, and you know what I mean? Like, it just kind of like, I guess it raised the tension. It was probably what I liked about it when I think about it. So, but it's something like that where you're just like, oh yeah, they actually got a lot done in some of those scenes. So yeah.
Jennifer, when you said that about the police station, there was just one policewoman who was just laughing the whole time while they're watching. The guys just stopped laughing. It's like, well, you're a little ahead, you're behind. And they're watching, and she's still laughing backstage. Would you be quiet? I'm trying to. But so that was what they feared the most. Women laughing at them for what they were doing.
Yeah.
And when it happened, it didn't even matter.
Right.
It didn't even faze them. Nobody ever laughed at them during the actual show that they did. And of course, Horse's family never laughed at them. The one person laughed was the policewoman who laughed, and she got shushed by Gerald because everybody was more focused on whether or not they could get their choreography synced.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of an economical way to indicate that the self-shame is starting to fall off. They can be watching this just like they would be watching, let's watch replays from Saturday's game. And they're bringing the same kind of practicality to it.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of other places where I thought they did a great job of economy of storytelling is that there's the scene where they decide they're all at Gerard's house, and Gaz says, we have to take our clothes off, because if we can't take our clothes off in front of each other, we're never going to be able to take them off in front of a bunch of women. Mm-hmm. And the way they take their clothes off is such a great encapsulation of their personality. Like Gerard is working away, getting like the button at the neck of his shirt undone. And some of them are just like pulling their shirts over their head or taking their clothes off very slowly, or guys just like flinging clothes around because he doesn't care. He loves being naked. And I thought that was a great, that's just all going on behind the scenes while some dialogue is going on. But if you watch it, you're like, yeah, each of those actors thought of the specific way that each of the characters would take their clothes off.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like this. One of my favorite lines was where Gaz was going to be the one who sewed the pants, because where did he learn how to sew? In prison. The son does it. It's just like this small, and he's like, but yet they all have these pants that work perfectly. So that was, anyway, so it's.
Well, that's great economy, because what is that? 2.5 seconds where you now find out that Gaz spent time in jail, and it was, it worked in perfectly with the logistical needs of the scene. And you've taken care of that piece of information.
Right. So I remember thinking like, oh, nicely done,
Yeah.
I did catch something this time though. The passing of the hat. So let me tell you what I mean by that. When they're at the police station and they finally bring the son around, he's wearing a police hat. They take it off his head. His head. At the very end, when Gaz is, I can't do this, the son hands him the hat.
Yes.
and tell, get out there,
Get out there.
do this thing. They're out there because of you. Take this hat. And then the song, the Tom Jones song they use.
Yeah. You can keep your hat on.
Oh my goodness. It's like screaming, by the way, if you didn't catch it, this hat is a symbol. And they keep the hat on until they don't.
Until they don't anymore. Yeah.
There is the point where they're just stripping versus when they go full Monty.
Mm-hmm.
I think that conversation is really important. Where the two women approach them. Like, we actually had the Chippendales here. We had the real thing here. So what do you guys have to offer that they could?
Yeah.
And then out of his behind, he pulls, we're going to do the full Monty without consulting with anybody. And that to me is where the stakes were raised to like, whoa, all the way to the ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you could hide certain things, but you can't hide anything when it's a full Monty. And it placed an enormous amount of stress on each of the characters with the exception of Guy. And probably Alomper probably didn't really care. But everybody else, it laid bare a couple of things. Like, this is a lot more serious than we were giving credit. It was us dancing before, and now it becomes the most vulnerable thing that we could possibly do as men in this steel town or former steel town. Because steel, that's a hard job. They're like the epitome of masculinity, whether it be toxic or not, but that's them.
Yeah.
And they're like, here I am with nothing on for your entertainment for one night only.
The thing that makes Gaz initially say he's not going to participate is that there are men in the audience, which seems I thought they could have done a little bit better job. I wasn't totally buying that, like him being the person saying we have to take our clothes off in front of each other, if we think we're going to take them off in the thing. The fact that he's so freaked out that there are men in the audience that he's withdrawing. Yeah, I just wasn't picking up enough on that idea of, this is a bunch of steel workers. Is there going to be problems? And I think part of it was because it was hard for me to imagine that there would be problems because problems like that don't happen in the world of the full Monty. Like, it's never going to become horrible. And so the fact that he was concerned about that was, like, just in my opinion, a slight weakness in the story setup.
Well, there's a trope in movies like this where the leader always is the last person to like completely commit to something that everybody else has already committed to around it. And I don't think it was necessarily that they were men in the audience. I think that gave him an excuse to back out of it, an excuse that maybe his son would accept if he didn't have the heart to follow through.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so that was
I
just
agree.
what you're saying.
I think it's kind of like in the screenwriting, the Save the Cat guy talks about whiff of death. I thought kind of like whiff of death because I thought the same thing. Oh, right. Of course it has to be him who like pushes the whole thing, who then is, I can't go and do it. So, and it just shows he's still like fairly juvenile character.
Yeah, I didn't have any objection to him balking at the last minute. It was just that I thought that the excuse was a little thin, but perhaps the excuse was intended to be thin, like you guys are saying. And it was just, he was grasping for any excuse.
Yeah.
Jen, Rand mentioned tropes. Any final tropes that you would like to mention about the full Monty?
Well, I think obviously there's a ton in there. And we've talked, a lot about a lot of them. We maybe didn't list them all, but definitely ticking time bomb because of all their jobs. And then that they, especially with Gaz, needs this money to be able to keep visiting his son. So I think there's like a lot of ticking time bomb action with that. And then again, like the whole forced proximity of them like being in this little town and having this time to do that. And the found family, we already talked about that. And then just their characters I see as kind of ugly duckling progressions, again, like we talked about with them kind of coming through with whatever their shame or not was. So, yeah, I think there's tons of ones in there. So, not surprising.
Yeah, I'm finding that the found family, once I started thinking in terms of tropes, thanks to you, I realized that the common theme of many of the movies and the books that I really appreciate is found family. That's always a draw for me.
I think it is for most people in different, it just depends on how the genre, does it. So the way they did it with sound.
Yeah. So cool. Well, thank you both very much for indulging my love of the full Monty. And I'd love to let everyone know where they can find out more about you. So Jen, let's start with you. Where can people go to find out more about you and everything you do online?
Oh yeah, thanks. Just jenniferhilt.com. Pretty easy.
Great. Thank you. And Rand, how about you?
Everything is at randwalker.com.
You guys are so easy. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jen and Rand. Is there a lesson from the full Monty that we didn't cover in our discussion? hop on over to the Indy Author on YouTube and let us know. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.